Welcome to Bible study, parody, and subversion in Matthew's Gospel. In the last episode, Jesus told a parable warning against meritocracy. The parable was an intensely radical teaching on equality. And lessons about equality can prove really hard for people to get. Old paradigms die hard. Unfortunately, I have a sad story that illustrates that. I worked for over 20 years as a frontline worker for a nonprofit mental health provider that contracted with the county to provide services for low-income families and individuals. Now, you might think that a liberal nonprofit mental health provider would promote values of equality and empowerment among its own workers, but you would be dead wrong. Well, at least in the case of the company that I worked for. We think of mental health as promoting confidence in people, helping them find their voice and their own power. And it does. But in our society, it usually does this on an individual level. It sometimes also works with families. But it almost never addresses institutional or societal structures that work in the opposite direction, against people's confidence and power, that tell people that they must accept their place in a hierarchy below some people and above others, according to the level that they have proven themselves worthy of occupying. So our company employed a CEO who was a psychologist and who made, in the year 2002, a $260,000 salary with a $12,000 expense account. I'm sure by now that salary must be well over $400,000. Meanwhile, some of the lowest paid full-time workers were eligible for federal food assistance and public housing. In 2006, and for a while after that, the company was paying case managers, people who work hands-on with individuals and families, $10 per hour. That would be $13.50 in today's money, which is well below a living wage in Southern California. We knew that similar programs run directly by the county paid substantially higher wages, and that was because the county workers were unionized. So we decided to unionize. And that decision made the management of our company go berserk. It turned out that the whole reason that the county doesn't run all the public mental health programs itself and instead contracts out to companies like the one that I worked for is so that frontline workers can be paid less and so that the management can be paid more. We found out that the CEO of our company was making substantially more than the director of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, who ran a much larger organization. So the management of our company did not just oppose our unionizing efforts. They hired a union-busting law firm to fight us. Now, mind you, the funding for our company came from the taxpayers. So they were using taxpayer money to pay union-busting lawyers. They attached anti-union memos to our paychecks. They fired some of the lowest-paid workers for organizing, which is illegal. But this was during the George W. Bush administration, so the Labor Board had been intentionally sabotaged by that administration and wasn't working as it should and couldn't enforce these sorts of laws. Yes, a liberal nonprofit took advantage of the conditions created by a Republican administration to keep its own workers from unionizing. They even called the police on us when we tried to go to other sites to talk to our coworkers. Well, we lost that union drive, unfortunately. A psychologist and other mental health professionals in upper management decided that they could not let their power and authority be challenged by lower caste workers. But that was not the only cruel irony of that unionizing drive. We had been organizing with the help of Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, one of the largest unions in California. I found out that SEIU has its own hierarchy. Not quite as brutal as our company. SEIU was much larger than our company, but the guy at the top made less than our CEO, and the frontline workers, the organizers, were paid really well. Nevertheless, there was a substantial pay differential, and the organizers worked really long hours and had little power to say no to anything they were asked to do or told to do. So the organizers decided to form a union for themselves, to collectively bargain with SEIU. And you guessed it, SEIU opposed their own organizers' union drive. I don't think they hired a union-busting firm, but just the fact that they opposed the very sort of thing they promoted everywhere else was really eye-opening to me. I learned that even some of the most self-identified progressive people will vigorously defend their own power and authority over others when it is challenged. They will fail to see the irony. They will fail to see any injustice in the structures that uphold their own power and privilege. Even among people and in traditions that claim enlightenment and an egalitarian ethos, hierarchy dies hard and defends itself viciously. This week's passage in Matthew contains a similar situation, in which at least some of the disciples fail to understand the full nature of Jesus' egalitarian vision and instead advocate for their own power and privilege over others. My name is Bert Newton, and this is episode 52 of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. Let's begin with verses 17 to 19 of chapter 20. While Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised." This is the third time that Jesus has said that he will be crucified in Jerusalem and then be raised from the dead. The first time was at the beginning of his journey toward Jerusalem. If you have been following along, you might remember that in chapter 16, covered in episode 43, we found Jesus and his disciples all the way up in the northern end of Galilee, in a place called Caesarea Philippi, the location of a temple to Augustus Caesar. It is there, we are told, that Jesus begins to talk about going to Jerusalem. And from what we can tell from the gospel narrative, he and his disciples have been working their way south to Jerusalem. At the end of chapter 17, they reach Capernaum at the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. At the beginning of chapter 19, they leave Galilee and enter an area that the narrator calls the land beyond the Jordan, probably Perea, which lies directly south of the Sea of Galilee. Then, at the end of this chapter, we will see them even further south in Jericho, having crossed into Judea, not very far from Jerusalem, which lies just a little further south and west. In contrast to all the wandering around Galilee up until the end of chapter 16, this journey has been almost a direct line south to Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples have trekked almost in a straight line from a city that has a temple to a dead Roman emperor toward a city that has a temple that is the seat of a Roman puppet government. And 3 times during this journey, Jesus tells his disciples that he is going to Jerusalem to be tortured, killed, and then raised from the dead. If Jesus were a military commander, like Joshua or David before him, this would be a martial campaign crossing from the far north of the country south to the capital city, conquering towns and cities along the way, killing many people, and forcing others to submit to their new rulers. But Jesus is not a military commander, like his namesake Joshua. He is not a king of conquest, like David. Instead, he teaches and heals along the way, giving life and not taking it. And when he reaches the capital city, there will be a showdown. But instead of killing his enemies, he will absorb their wrath, taking it into himself, before rising in victory over the forces of death. Let's continue with verses 20 to 28. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked a favor of him. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." But Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." He said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left, this is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard it, they were angry with the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." So the mother of James and John approaches Jesus with a request to give prominent places in the new society to her 2 sons. And all my Jewish friends cue up their Jewish mother jokes, which I usually don't understand. Anyway, the first time, at the end of chapter 16, that Jesus says that he is going to Jerusalem to be crucified and then raised from the dead, Peter tries to stop him. Even though Jesus says that he will be raised from the dead, all Peter seems to hear is that Jesus will suffer and be killed, and that is what he reacts to. The second time Jesus talks about it, in chapter 17, there is no mention of a response from anyone. This time, here in chapter 20, the Zebedee family is all for it, trying to position themselves to ride this victory wave to the top level of the new society. In contrast to Peter, the Zebedees focus on the resurrection part. I've mentioned this before, but the theme of resurrection first occurs in ancient Israelite literature in the context of liberation from empire. Perhaps the first mention of resurrection is in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, when it is used as a metaphor for liberation from the Babylonian Empire, specifically the return of those who have been exiled in Babylon back to the land of Israel. Verse 12 reads, "Thus says the Lord God, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel." Later in the 2nd century BCE, addressing oppression under the Seleucid Empire, the books of Daniel, 1st Enoch, and 2nd Maccabees all speak of a more literal resurrection as the final liberation from and victory over imperial oppressors. The Psalms of Solomon in the 1st century BCE also uses resurrection in a similar way in the context of an oppressive Israelite monarchy, the Hasmonean monarchy, and the subsequent suffering of the people of Israel at the hands of the Roman Empire. And Jesus in Matthew has been using the Jonah story, a story of nonviolent prophetic victory over the Assyrian Empire, as a metaphor for his own work, interpreting it as a story of resurrection. So the original audience of Matthew, and ostensibly the Zebedee family in the story of Matthew, understand that when Jesus speaks of resurrection, he is speaking of victory over the evil empire and ruling establishment that they currently suffer under. They reasonably expect that Jesus will somehow, through his death and resurrection, defeat the Romans and the Roman puppet government in Jerusalem and establish a new kingdom where they will rule. And maybe this is progress. Peter only saw the cross. The Zebedees, at least, understand that resurrection will have the final word in Jerusalem. But they still don't understand the nature of the kingdom of heaven. They assume that it will be like all the other kingdoms that they are familiar with, the kingdoms of this world. They assume that it will be hierarchical. They assume this in spite of Jesus teaching them to assume the status of children, teaching them to put aside their male privilege, and proclaiming twice that the first will be last and the last will be first in the new society. A rhetorical great reversal that is meant to communicate a vision of a great leveling of society. But maybe he has not been clear enough. Maybe all this talk of liberation for the poor, forgiveness of debts for everyone, laying aside privilege, can still somehow be understood in the context of hierarchy. Maybe they took the great reversal too literally, not as a great leveling, but as a reverse hierarchy, where they, lowly peasants, might end up at the top. It might be hard for us to understand how they could misunderstand, that is, until we look at our own churches and progressive institutions, which usually maintain hierarchical structures. Then maybe we get it. Maybe. So Jesus has to be really, really clear. He says, "You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you, but whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave." There. Maybe that makes it clear. Notice that this teaching is overtly political. Jesus references the nations and their rulers. This is political. It is not sentimentally spiritual. It is politically spiritual. It is a new political spirituality and a new political structure. Notice that this is in response to a request for a position of status and power. It is not in response to how someone uses that position. It is not in response to how someone uses that power. Jesus is not saying that people in hierarchical positions of authority and power should act like servants. He is saying that the new society, the kingdom of heaven, will not have hierarchical structures. People will not be in those positions of greater status, power, and authority. There is a common way of thinking that holds that hierarchies and the power discrepancies that hierarchies entail are fine. The important thing is how people use their power. So in the liberal mental health company that I worked for, the management completely accepted hierarchy of power and compensation because they believed that they were benevolent managers. They trained their supervisors and program directors to be good supervisors and directors, providing the staff under their authority with the support necessary to grow and perhaps climb the ladder in the company. They held diversity trainings and other sorts of trainings on fairness. They were liberal and enlightened, so hierarchy was acceptable. They, in theory, provided the opportunity for everyone who worked hard to rise to the top. But what if everyone worked equally hard? Could everyone rise to the top? Were there enough positions at the top? who would do the frontline work if everyone rose to the top? Those questions, of course, were never asked because they knew the answers, which is that there are only a limited number of positions at the top, and they already had them. Their message of equality was a smokescreen to preserve hierarchy based on the mirage of meritocracy. But Jesus rejects hierarchy. Or does he? He says that his Father will decide who sits at his right and at his left. That implies an image of a king on a throne with vice rulers at either side. Isn't that an image of hierarchy? Well, let's look at that. Jesus says, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am able to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." He said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left, this is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." Now, what does Jesus mean by, "Are you able to drink the cup I'm about to drink?" That, of course, is a reference to the crucifixion. The cup that Jesus is about to drink is the cup of martyrdom. That is how he refers to it in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane later in the story. He is asking if they can follow in the way of the cross. Can they drink this cup of martyrdom? But is he saying that if they drink it, and he says that they will, then perhaps God will place them at his right and left? Well, maybe, but let's look at what sitting at his right and left means. Remember, Jesus' glorification, the coming of the Son of Man, begins at the crucifixion. Back in chapter 16, Jesus paired the crucifixion and resurrection with the coming of the Son of Man. The coming of the Son of Man begins at the crucifixion. This was understood by all the writers of the New Testament, which is why the cross was understood by the early church as a symbol not only of sacrifice, but also of victory. The cross was a symbol of victory in the early church. So when Jesus speaks of his right and his left, he is talking about the cross, as well as anything that comes after it. And in fact, that is the same language that will be used later in chapter 27, verse 38. The language in that verse used to describe the position of the two bandits that are crucified with Jesus is the same verbiage in Greek used in this passage regarding the disciples' wish to be positioned on Jesus' right and left. Then Jesus goes on to say, "Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus explicitly connects the cross with the structure of the kingdom of heaven, the structure of the new society. Jesus is saying that if someone wishes to be great in the new society, they must serve everyone else, even be ready to actually give their life for others. Not metaphorically or sentimentally, the way servant leadership is often spoken of today in a way that attempts to mask a hierarchy that remains in place with leaders who have no intention of sacrificing themselves for their subordinates, but in a real and actual way. The only leadership that Jesus recognizes for the new society is demonstrated servant leadership. Positional leadership won't really be a thing in the new society unless one is positioned on a cross. Leadership in the new society means being a servant, even a slave. Leadership is always cruciform. Now, when Jesus says that he will give his life as a ransom for many, that may sound to many modern Christians like a statement of penal substitutionary atonement. the idea that Jesus' death on a cross paid some cosmic debt for our sins. Jesus' death is the ransom, the debt payment. There are various versions of this sort of atonement theory in Christianity. In one version, the death of Jesus is the price demanded by God for human sins. In another version, it is the price paid to the devil. And in yet another version, it is the price demanded by cosmic justice, apparently apart from God or any other named deity. Whichever version we are dealing with, all theories of penal substitutionary atonement bring many questions, such as, why is that the price for human sin? And if it is a debt owed to God, why can't God just forgive the debt rather than kill Jesus? And if it is a payment for a debt, doesn't the resurrection nullify the payment? Isn't that like paying a debt and then taking back the money? Of course, answers for those questions can be constructed by those who really want to maintain that theory. Suffice it to say that penal substitutionary atonement theory has a lot of internal problems, if taken literally. However, it might be understood as metaphor. The book of Leviticus prescribes sacrifices to atone for human sin, and this sacrificial language is, in several places in the New Testament, applied to Jesus. I'll leave aside the question as to whether the sin sacrifices prescribed in Leviticus and elsewhere are strictly substitutionary, but let's just go with the idea that they are. In that sense, then, the ransom language might be seen as substitutionary. Jesus' life is the ransom, the sacrifice paid for the sin of humanity. But it is metaphor. And here's the thing. Ransom language was used in ancient Israelite literature to speak of liberation. The ancient Greek version of Exodus 6:6 reads, "Say therefore to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and ransom," same Greek word, "ransom you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment." In the same way, Deuteronomy 7:8 reads, "It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and ransomed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." And then, speaking of deliverance from the Babylonian Empire, Isaiah 43:1 declares, "But now thus says the Lord, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." Then 4th Maccabees speaks of martyrs who died in service of the freedom of Israel from the Seleucid Empire as a ransom and as sacrifices of atonement. 4th Maccabees 17:20-22 reads, "These then who have been consecrated for the sake of God are honored not only with this honor, but also by the fact that because of them our enemies did not rule over our nation. The tyrant was punished and the homeland purified, they having become, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation. And through the blood of those devout ones and their death as an atoning sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel that previously had been mistreated." So Jesus as a ransom does not mean that Jesus' death is literally a substitute for human sin in some cosmic transaction, but rather it is a way of talking about martyrdom as a redeeming action. There is a sense in which all martyrs for justice and freedom pay the price of human sin. Let's continue with verses 29-33. "As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. There were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they shouted, 'Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David.' The crowd sternly ordered them to be quiet, but they shouted even more loudly, "Have mercy on us, Lord, Son of David." Jesus stood still and called them, saying, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately they regained their sight, and they followed him. Suddenly, we find Jesus and the disciples leaving Jericho. Who said anything about Jericho? There was no mention of entering Jericho, and now they're suddenly leaving it? Perhaps this is the author's way of telling us that things are moving quickly toward a climax. Some commentators interpret the mention of Jericho as Joshua imagery. Joshua took Jericho on his way to making his conquest of Jerusalem. Joshua took Jericho by circling it while blowing trumpets and then having the people shout. Here the blind men shout twice, and they shout louder the second time. They shout to Jesus. So perhaps this is Joshua imagery. The sudden leaving of Jericho symbolizes the conquest. But the conquest is not one of killing, but of healing, as he marches on Jerusalem. But Joshua is not the only one said to have captured Jerusalem. David is also said to have captured Jerusalem. There are several different traditions in the Hebrew Scriptures regarding how Jerusalem came to be part of Israel, and rather than review them here, I'll put a link to an explanation of them by Rabbi Zev Farber at thetorah.com in the show notes. So David is said to have captured Jerusalem, and the blind men shout out to Jesus, "Have mercy on us, Lord, Son of David." Interestingly, David is said to have attacked the blind and the lame in his conquest of Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 5:6-8 reads, "The king and his men marched on Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, 'You will not come in here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you back,' thinking, 'David cannot come in here.' Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. David had said on that day, 'Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates.' Therefore it is said, 'The blind and the lame shall not come into the house.'" Yet we will see in the next passage that Jesus will, in fact, bring the blind and the lame into the house. Tune back into the next episode for that. So the crowd tries to stop the blind men from coming to Jesus, just as the disciples tried to stop the children from coming. The crowd still does not understand the full nature of Jesus' vision for a new society. Their eyes are not yet fully opened. The Zebedee family in the previous scene demonstrated similar blindness, but the blind men seek to have their eyes opened, and the request is granted. The healing of the blind men also signals that the great event about to take place in Jerusalem will be eye-opening. It will reveal the open secret of temple corruption. It will reveal the dynamics of power, and it will reveal the strength of the God of life and mercy over the forces of death. And that will happen beginning in chapter 21, when the crowds, like the blind men, also cry out to Jesus, calling him Son of David. They call him not just to have mercy, but to save them. That will all be in the next episode. For now, my name is Bert Newton. The music for this episode is provided by Bob Nolte and David Martin. Please spread the word about this podcast. Thanks to all who have done that and who have supported this podcast. You can send questions and comments to subversivewisdom@gmail.com. This has been episode 52 of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel.